Hello, Ken.
Hello, Raquel.
Hey, thank you for being with us in this 11th edition of the Integral Spanish Conference, which is a real honor and a real privilege to have you again with us.
Well, it's an honor to be here and a delight. I'm so glad that this is the 11th consecutive year that this has been going. This is wonderful. And so I'm delighted to be here and to be with all of you.
Thank you, Ken. It's really wonderful that you're present, even though you cannot be present physically with us, but we feel you so clearly like a part of this event, not only this year, but all the past years that you've been so generous to be with us. So, we have prepared a new set of questions with you, and very kind of you to make this interview through the telephone as well, because as we told you, technical problems avoid the possibility of doing it direct call.
Right.
So thank you for doing it in defer.
Sure.
Yes, thank you, darling. So all the community, all the Integral community, we have an open website, like open list in the website for the conference, and people have been putting their questions there that they wanted that I asked you today.
Oh.
So this is not my questions, but this is the questions of the Integral community.
Okay.
And for your information, this year, the meeting of the conference is going to take place in the Indignates site of Barcelona.
Wow.
Yes. It has some kind of social aspect to it, and it is very interesting because many of the people which are from the Indignates movement, which is, are taking real social actions and everything, are creating like groups of neighborhood groups and things like that, and they are working clearly toward a new politic atmosphere in Spain.
Right.
They are coming to this 11th edition of the Integral Conference. So we are doing it at their site in Barcelona.
Oh, well, that sounds fascinating. Barcelona is so beautiful and such a wonderful city in general. It sounds terrific to have the meeting there.
Yes, absolutely. So let's see this political flavor and social flavor. For your information also, this year, the new board of the Spanish Integral Association has created a way of different tables, thematic tables, which will be, like 5 people or 6 people in each table, and it will be integral politics, integral health, integral education, and blah, blah, blah. You see, so different tables that will be talking with 5 or 6 people every table.
Oh, wonderful.
Yes.
It sounds like a great way to do it.
Yes. So, okay, let's go with the first question is that someone, and me, and I think everyone wants to know about how is your health? How do you feel?
Oh, well, thank you. I'm doing pretty well. I've had this chronic illness that I got in 1984 in North Lake Tahoe, where some 300 people in a very, very small town came down with this chronic illness. And it's really devastating in the sense of how it robs your body of energy. Now, fortunately, when I got the illness, I only really did 2 major things. I sat in a corner and meditate, and I sat in a corner and wrote. And so I could continue doing both of those with this illness. But if I had been a surgeon or even a waiter, I would have had to quit my job, and because you just can't move around like that. The Centers for Disease Control in America went from saying that it was just a psychosomatic illness, in other words, it wasn't real, to estimating that over 400,000 Americans have it, and the latest estimate is close to 4 million Americans have it. The Canadians have an entire department devoted to it. The Japanese have an entire department of government devoted to it. It's truly an epidemic, and it's really irritating. But fortunately, it hasn't exactly killed me. I mean, I can't move around much, but I can still meditate and write and do calls and record dialogues and stuff like that. So I've been able to carry it forward, but it's really unpleasant that I can't travel, for example. So I can't be at this meeting, or I can't be at the Europe. Yeah, and that's very disappointing.
Yes. We miss you, really, but we also understand your situation. So thank you for at least, like you say, being able to do recordings and still writing for us. And this is like the next question, in the sense of we heard that you are writing again.
Yes.
And we would like to know how advanced are you with those 5 books that you told us that you were preparing.
Right. Well, I'm doing really quite well. I have largely finished the follow-up to Sex, Ecology, Spirituality. So it's another, it's another very large book. It's about the same size as Sex, Ecology, Spirituality. There's a lot of new stuff in it, and I like it a lot. I think people are going to enjoy it. And it has a lot of new material, like on social hold-ons and culture and integral semiotics, which is an extremely important topic.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And individual and collective hold-ons, and of course the 8 major zones and integral methodological pluralism. And so that I feel really good about that book. Do you
have a name for it already?
I've been calling it Volume 2 for so long. That's what I keep calling it, Volume 2. And then the other sort of idiotic joke was that on the Sex, Ecology, Spirituality was always meant to be first in a trilogy, 3 volumes. And I swore I was going to start the title of all 3 books with the word sex. Just sort of as an inside joke, and because it sells. So I'd been calling this one Sex, Karma, and Creativity, but I don't know.
All right.
But I don't know exactly.
I don't know what the academics will say about the word karma.
Yeah, I know. But I haven't really ever worried very much about whether academics like this or not.
I know. Well, it's kind of disgusting, when I was in the ITC, to see how the academics, the ones which are so strict, just don't get it. Don't get the integral theory at all.
I know. And
unfortunately,
they're trained to think in a very specific way, which is almost always first tier, and it's very narrow, and it's very fragmented, and it's very partial, and they just simply aren't ready to think in any broader or deeper or wider ways. And so for that reason, I haven't really been all that concerned about what they say or what they think. The work that they're producing is extremely unimpressive and extremely narrow and extremely fragmented.
And very biased.
And very biased. It's just not, it's not even a healthy way to think.
No, it's not. It's very reduced. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I would say that it belongs only to the exterior quadrants, I would say, and even more only to the upper right quadrant.
Largely so. I mean, it's still strange, but I mean, after all we know and all the different types of methodologies that are out there and all of the different types of approaches that are out there, the academic world still has its own very narrow system of thinking and very partial and fragmented viewpoints. But those are taken, dogmatically. That's the way you have to think. That's the way you have to write. And it's really just sad. It's just really, truly unfortunate. Because there's so much more available to human beings, and there's so much more potential that human beings can activate in their own being, in their own awareness, in their own consciousness, in their own lives, in their relationships, in their parenting, in their play, in their work, and none of that gets addressed by academia. So it's really sad. I mean, we're really preparing kids to be broken and torn and fragmented, and that's what we're teaching them, and it's just sad.
I agree 100%. Okay, so in this same line, how do you see the actual world situation? Because let's broaden up the sea, the view, let's say. And how do you see the actual situation of the whole world?
Well,
not only the academical world, but the whole world.
Right. Well, one of the fascinating things as you look at, let's say, the AQUAL integral framework, all quadrants, all levels, all lines, all states, all types. And if you look at those 5 elements, most of them are still relatively unknown to the world at large. They're relatively unknown in academia. They're relatively unknown in conventional culture. They're relatively unknown in the world itself. And these are just some of the most fundamental, absolutely necessary components for understanding a human being. So stages of development, for example, by whatever model we use, and there are dozens of them, but they all have essentially the same general levels of development, levels of unfolding, and we can even use a variation on Jean Gebser and refer to them as archaic, magic, mythic, rational, pluralistic, integral, superintegral. But whatever model we use, and again, there are dozens, most people are completely unaware of any stages of development. And so they don't...
They even deny it. There are stages of development, which is so crazy, because they don't look at their own babies.
Yeah, I know. The green pluralistic postmodern stage denies that there are stages altogether.
Right.
And so it's ridiculous. I mean, we have studies in over 40 cultures now where different models have been found to show the same results. And yet people just continue to be unaware of that. They're almost completely unaware of states of development. And that means meditative states and things like awakening or enlightenment or satori or metanoia, completely unaware of changes in state of consciousness to give access to ultimate reality or ultimate truth or Buddha nature or Godhead or Tao or Brahman. But people are basically just completely unaware of those states of consciousness.
And do you think that is this the reason why the actual situation is so awful as it is?
Well, sure. I mean, if you don't have any understanding of, let's say, different stages of development, and if you are at any of the first tier stages, one of Claire Grace's definition of a first tier stage is that each first tier stage believes that its truth and values are the only real truth or values in existence.
Right.
And so, of course, those first 6 major stages, which are 95% of the population, 95% of the world's population are at a stage of development where they believe that their values and their values alone are real. And everybody else is wrong. Now, under those circumstances, how on earth are you going to have world peace when you have 95% of the population that believes that everybody except their own group is wrong?
Right.
And you can't think about levels, think about worldviews. You can't change those just by getting more evidence or more data or reasoning about it logically. You have to grow through those stages. It takes some time, and it takes some experience, and it takes, according to Robert Keegan, if you're trying to develop through those stages, it takes an average of 5 years to move through a stage.
Yes.
So we have the world full of people at different stages, every one of whom thinks that all of the others are absolutely wrong. So how on earth can we have anything resembling a peaceful world when we have 95% of its population bent essentially on warfare, either theoretical warfare or actual physical warfare?
Physical. Mm-hmm.
That's what they're bent on.
So we could say then, Ken, that this, first of all, like you say, like the Buddha is absolute ignorance, first of all. You know, the Buddha saying that the let's say the bad part of the world, the shadow of the world and the shadow of humanity is ignorance.
Well, very much so. And it's the fact that individuals can have access to some of these states. They're still going to interpret those states according to whatever structure stage they're at. Yeah. So there are things like the Sinhalese Buddhists in Sri Lanka, and they're at the mythic, ethnocentric stage of development. So they believe that they have the only correct Buddhist Dharma, that Sri Lanka is the home of the only correct Buddhist Dharma, that they are in charge of saying what's right and what's wrong in terms of Buddhist belief. Right. And because they're ethnocentric, very much us versus them, they're in constant physical warfare with the Tamil Hindus. Now, these are Buddhists. The fact that you have access to higher states doesn't mean that you have access to higher structures.
Structures, right. Mm-hmm.
So you're going to interpret your states through whatever your structure is. And if you're ethnocentric, fundamentalist, mythic, that's how you will interpret your enlightenment. And that's how the Sinhalese Buddhists interpret theirs. So, we have to have growth in both axes. We have to have growth in states, and we have to have growth in structures. And if we don't have both of those, we're going to remain with 95% of the world's population bent on warfare. It's ridiculous.
Oh, wow. What little hope then we have, Ken.
Well,
unfortunately. It's a pity, but it's the truth.
Well, one of the interesting things is that if you look at where, like, these structures are stored, because they are not stored just in the human brain, because they show up the same in all various cultures. And so it's like if you look at when you first synthesize a very large protein, that protein can fold into literally 1,000 different forms. But once it folds into one form, and this is a standard morphogenetic field material, once it folds into one form, then all subsequent proteins will fold into that identical form, always, with no exceptions. So where is that form stored? Since it's not stored in the protein, where is it stored? Well, we don't know. According to the Lankavatara Sutra, it's in the storehouse consciousness. According to some Eastern traditions, it's in the Akashic record. But wherever it is definitely being stored in a very real place, in the very real universe, because that form reaches down and governs the form of every single protein that's created from that time forward. And it's the same with these various structures. Somebody at red or magic, or somebody at amber or mythic, has the same form, whether they're in Mexico or Germany, whether they're in Russia or India, whether they're in Japan or New Mexico. These forms are stored someplace in the real world. And that means that the integral form is also stored someplace in the real world. And so every time you have an integral thought, every time you conceive an integral idea, every time you study integral material, or every time you write or think integral material, those forms are being stored. And at some point, they will spill out and into the actual material sensorimotor world and transform it. So,
let's make it already.
So people should lose all hope.
What is it?
People shouldn't lose all hope. People shouldn't get depressed by the fact that
I know.
we're not showing progress, because every time any of us has any of these integral thoughts, that's actually building up and building up and building up, and it will have an impact on the world.
Mm-hmm. Right. David Spangler, have you heard about David Spangler?
Yes, I know the name.
Okay, long time ago, I'm talking about 25 years ago, he said that we are responsible of the way we think about the future, and that precisely we have to really think positively in the sense of hope, having hope for the future, because if not, we get so depressed that then our own thinking will be creating a black future for us.
Right. Well, something like that, I think, is certainly the case. And so individuals, I mean, you can just look at 11 years of Spanish integral association, means 11 years that individuals in that association have been helping to build integral forms and integral structures that are being stored, just like the form of that protein. They are being stored. And at some point, they will overflow and reach down and just hammer the sensorimotor world into a new configuration, a new shape, a new form. So it will happen.
It will happen. We believe it. Let's go with the second question that goes in: what would you recommend to the future integral leaders? As the narcissism is the postmodern problem connected to the green level of consciousness, which will be the challenge that these leaders will find in a society that enters the second tier and gets installed in Emerald?
And gets the what in Emerald?
And enters the second tier and gets installed in Emerald.
Clearly, overcoming narcissism is part of it. And Green, indeed, has become extremely narcissistic. Studies show that in the States, anyway, the recent graduating class has the highest score of narcissism on tests since testing was begun. It's 2 to 3 times higher than their boomer parents. And the boomers were called the me generation, for heaven's sake.
Yeah.
And so narcissists taught that those kids, and they turned out to be even more narcissistic. So that's a real problem, and that's one of the issues that Green is just spreading, like crazy. So
so what would you recommend then to a future integral leader, that has overcome that narcissism, let's say,
Well, exactly. But what has to happen is the same thing that put narcissism in our schools and in our culture is going to have to take it out. I mean, that's the one thing that we did learn about all of this, is that the educational system can be changed quite dramatically. In this case, it was for the worse. But the lesson is that it can be changed. And so the first thing we have to do is to put the educational system, at the very least, put it back the way we found it, which was aiming towards achievement and accomplishment and excellence and merit and so on, unlike Green, which was no grades, no ranking, everybody gets a gold star, everybody's equally special, which, of course, just devastates real self-esteem, because you don't earn self-esteem by just telling yourself you're special, but by doing something special. And that's what we forgot. So we need to fix the educational system, and we know it can be fixed because we tried to do it once before, and we just did it wrong. So we need to fix it back, for starters, because people with that degree of narcissism will never transform to second tier. It won't happen. it is that in itself will prevent an integral viewpoint, because an integral viewpoint.
But Ken, if it will never happen, all the boomers, if you say that the boomers will never turn into second tier, how then is going to happen that shift from boomers, narcissistic postmoderns, to post-postmoderns and second-tier consciousness?
What I said was that the people that had the amount of narcissism that the recent graduating class had will never be able to transform to second tier. Boomers were indeed narcissistic, but there's a whole range of narcissism in the generation, and about a third of them are extremely narcissistic, but about 2/3 of them are fairly normal, fairly average when it comes to that.
Uh-huh.
So they'll be fine. But postmodernism in general is kind of stuck in nihilism and narcissism. And postmodernism itself, as a philosophical movement, though, is winding down to some degree. It's realized, for example, that postmodernism officially is dead. As Terry Eagleton put it, postmodernism is as dead as a movement can be, and he's a major postmodernist. So that's died down, and of course everybody's asking what's next, and what's next is either some form of integral or some form of more narrowly evolutionary, meaning mostly just lower right quadrant evolutionary, systems thinking, evolutionary thinking, which of course is included in integral, but isn't the whole thing.
No.
But one of those two are the next logical steps. We, of course, think integral covers more territory and does a better job of it. So naturally, we're pulling for that, and it does seem to be increasing in a lot of ways. So we'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so what do you consider that is a disease? What would you say that is a disease? Because talking about a disease, we're not talking about an accident or an intoxication or radiation, but a disease. What is for you a disease?
We're talking like psychopathology?
Yes.
Psychological, spiritual disease?
I would say that the person that has made this question means like a physical disease. Like a person which is sick because has maybe, a problem with the heart or with the kidneys or, some systemic physical disease.
Well, that's exactly the problem. Whatever system the particular organ is a part of has become dysfunctional, has become malfunctional, isn't working right. And that can be for any number of reasons. It can be a viral infection, a bacterial infection. It can be a degenerative disease. It can be an autoimmune disease. And what happens in any disease process is that the holons making up whatever it is that's diseased become uncoordinated and disjointed and out of balance with each other. So either the agency or the communion or the eros or the agape becomes pathological. And if agency becomes pathological, then autonomy becomes a rigid isolation and a rigid separation and an alienation. And if communion becomes pathological, then the person isn't just in relationship. There's a fusion, a meltdown. The person defines themselves entirely in terms of their relationship, and they have no autonomy or self-authoring at all. And so that will cause illness. If eros becomes pathological, it turns to phobos. And it doesn't just transcend and include, it's transcend and repress. And so the actual entities gets caught in broken forms of wholeness and in fear of the lower, and attempts to repress the lower and seal it off and get away from it, escape from it. So it transcends and represses. It doesn't transcend and include.
Right.
And if agape becomes pathological, then it's not just the embrace of the lower, but a regression to the lower. And the ultimate regression is all the way down to matter. In other words, the death instinct, the death drive. And that, of course, is very pathological. So if any component of the holon breaks, then the system that it's making up and the organ that is particularly broken will stop functioning correctly and will start to break down. And when that happens, then you have a disease. And the disease will, of course, vary in severity depending on just how broken each of those parts are.
Right. How interesting, Ken. You presented it in a very interesting way.
You can also have there is the notion of involution and evolution. And involution, which Plotinus called efflux, is where spirit moves downward and outward, so to speak, from spirit as spirit to spirit as subtle soul, to spirit as subtle mind, to spirit as vital body, to spirit as insentient matter, or from causal to subtle to gross realms. And if there's some sort of dysfunction in a higher realm, so if a person has like a soul illness, if their soul is not functioning right, if it's not loving enough, or if it's not caring enough, or if it's not aware enough, then that soul malfunction will translate downward into a physical illness. And so this is what things like acupuncture or working with chakras and so on tend to work with subtle energy that is giving rise to gross energy malfunctions. And so that's another source of physical disease. It's a problem with subtle or the causal domains. And so you have to keep an eye on those.
Absolutely. Very important.
Yeah.
Thank you. Then could we consider the romantic authors, like, for example, Goethe, Schelling, or Byron, or Emerson as real sparkles of the green level in the historical evolution of consciousness?
Well, certainly in their healthy versions, they were that. And some of them had a degree of integral thinking as well. Certainly somebody like Schelling.
Mm-hmm.
But otherwise, yes, the Romantic movement was, in general, a fairly healthy emergence of green, and the first major emergence of green. Now, of course, green also has an unhealthy version, and we see a degree of that unhealthy version in some of the Romantics. And one of the unhealthy versions of green is, of course, narcissism.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is one of the problems that a lot of the Romantic poets and Romantic artists had, was self-absorption, self-obsession. And were well known for it. So they were green in both ways.
In both ways, yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, if we follow Zimmerman in the Heidegger's confrontation with modernity, you know that book?
Yep.
Which is Heidegger's confrontation with modernity.
Yep.
So if we follow Zimmerman in that book, wouldn't we understand Nazism as the first pathology of the green level?
Well, yes, Nazism is a complex topic because if you look at it, there were really several different types of central ideas that it had, and in some ways it certainly was green, in that there was a Romantic movement to it, and it had a blood and soil mythology, but it was very ethnocentric in that belief. So it was very race-oriented, and believed in a superior race and inferior races, and believed that the Nordic tribes, the Aryans, were superior in every way. And so non-Aryans were essentially to be removed. And of course that meant anybody that was non-Aryan and anybody that was mentally unhealthy or mentally diseased could be, at the very least, made reproductively inactive.
Yes.
So people that were had inferior IQs, for example, if they were males, their genitals were X-rayed until they couldn't produce sperm, and then of course if you're something like a non-Aryan race, whether that was Jewish or Polish, then you were exterminated. If you were homosexual, you were exterminated, and so on. So that was all very ethnocentric. That was all very amber. That was all very mythic and mythological. And so there was a great deal of drawing on the ancient myths and attempting to put them in a new context, but a context that was still clearly mythic and amber. But the Nazis were very, very, very good at creating and manipulating mythic imagery to have a very strong impact. And, I mean, all you have to do is watch Leni Riefenstahl's film Triumph of the Will to see, you know, the Nazis at their symbolically most intense. And of course, Leni Riefenstahl was a genius. But she, in a sense, ended up glamorizing Nazism and showing it, you know, almost like a Calvin Klein underwear ad.
Absolutely.
So it would, but that was combined with modern technology, and that's where the problems came about, because the mythic structure was incapable of producing the sophisticated technology that the Nazis did. So they were very rational when it came to that. And they combined that rational technology with an ancient mythology, and got very, very caught up in a pre-trans fallacy there.
Yes.
And so that was what was appealing to so many people about it.
But why do you think that this person, which is making this question, why do you think that this person sees it as the pathology of the green level?
Well, I think because of the misinterpretation that the Nazis gave, because whereas green is in many cases, you know, very romantic and very
together.
Yeah, but it's also non-marginalizing and inclusive. And the Nazis were just the opposite. They were.
That's why I don't understand the question of green level, because I don't see where this person sees the Nazism related to the green level.
Yeah, I think only in certain of its romantic movements. But primarily, I agree. I mean, it was primarily amber mythology combined with rational modern technology.
Yeah, I see it more mythic than anything, yes.
Yeah.
Let's say, talking about Heidegger, how valuable is for you Heidegger? How do you appreciate his contributions?
Well, Heidegger was one of the first really brilliant green thinkers. But as such, he made a lot of classic green mistakes, including blaming modernity for sort of all of mankind's problems, and then going back to the pre-Socratics and seeing them as being more immersed in a pure being. So he was caught in a pre-trans fallacy.
As well, yes.
Yeah, and that's actually what Zimmerman said that what got him out of Heidegger's pre-trans fallacy was reading my work. And he's been very open about that. And so it helped him get out of the rut that you end up with Heidegger. So but in terms of some of the things that he introduced, the importance of interpretation and combining that with Dilthey's hermeneutics and Kierkegaard's existentialism and so on. In all those ways, it was quite brilliant. But then he, as has been well publicized, he threw in with the Nazis. And this was exactly because of his own confusion about the role of modernity. And the Nazis seemed to overcome that by going back to mythic modes. And so Habermas was right, I think, when he said about Heidegger that nobody can blame, looking back on it, nobody can really blame anybody for getting into the Nazi movement, because we don't know what we would do faced with those same kind of pressures and the same kinds of options that were open at that time. But after the war and after the camps and after seeing everything that they did, to not condemn them is criminal.
Yes.
And that's what Heidegger refused to do. He refused to condemn them. And that's where he can be criticized, and rightly so. And that was not only a problem in his character, but it was an inherent problem in his philosophy.
Absolutely. Very clear, Ken. Yes, thank you. So what would you say that is the importance and value of transactional analysis as a tool for the study of behavior at the upper left quadrant?
Well, when it comes to forms of psychotherapy, there's always, just a pretty good bit of personal favoritism that always finds its way in. I mean, people just seem to be attracted to certain therapies for, whatever number of unknown reasons. But I've always just really liked transactional analysis. I've always thought it was a fairly simple, straightforward mode, and it dealt particularly with what I call fulcrum 4, or the rule-role mind, where what happens with fulcrum 3 is concepts that just emerge, and the mind is starting to differentiate from the body. And that can go too far, and the mind can dissociate or repress the body. And then we get the standard psychoneuroses of, repressing sex or aggression or power or some such. And then the result is anxiety or depression or obsessive compulsive and so on. Sort of standard Freudian stuff. But when you get to the next level, is the emergence of concrete operational thinking, or the rule-role mind. And there, the concern is not with how the mind fits with the body, but how your role fits with other roles in society, and how you get along with those around you, and how you interact, how you follow the rules, and how you fit with the roles that are offered you in society. And transactional analysis focuses on all of those, and all of the games, the social games that people play in culture. And so it doesn't really focus on bodily repression. It focuses on social interaction. And so it lists just the typical kinds of games that people play, and it points out the positives that people get even out of games that end up hurting them. And so, and then it divides the self into the parent, adult, and child ego, which is similar-ish to superego, ego, and id. But it focuses on how we can actually hear these as sort of subpersonalities and voices in our own inner dialogue. And so it works with those and helps individuals disidentify with them and eventually end up integrating them. So I've always been a bit of a fan of transactional analysis, and the simple therapeutic technique that I created called the 3-2-1 process. I got that idea originally from Gestalt therapy and Fritz Perls, and from transactional analysis.
All right.
Yeah. And actually, I think sort of the second paper I ever wrote was called Towards a Working Synthesis of Transactional Analysis and Gestalt Therapy. And it was,
all right. I haven't read that paper.
It was actually published in one of the largest psychotherapeutic journals at the time. So it's pretty cool.
I would like to see that somewhere. It's probably in Shambhala or something.
It's in the collected works.
Oh, God, yes, but the collected works never arrived in Spain. Unfortunately. And when I went to Pearl Street in Boulder, I saw it sold in the shelf of the library, and I saw it was so big and kind of expensive as well. And I said, oh, no, I'm not going to be able to buy this because I will never get to it. I will never be able to read it all. It's so big, Ken. It's fantastic.
And I'm 4 volumes behind on it.
God, it's so fantastic. I loved it, but I just couldn't take it back in the luggage. It was too big.
I understand.
Anyway, sometime I will get it. Let's see another question. It's how do we know in which level and stage we are? When do we integrate the previous level and access the following?
Well, that depends primarily on which specific model of development you're using. Because the thing about development is it's a very broad, general evolutionary current. And not only are there at least a dozen multiple intelligences there, there are numerous different ways to look at each of those intelligences. Now, most of the pioneering developmental models, whether they knew it or not, ended up selecting one major intelligence to study. And so Piaget used cognitive intelligence, and Kohlberg used moral intelligence, and Levinger used ego development, and so on. And so each of those, of course, each of those models are accurate for the particular intelligence that they cover, but they don't cover the other intelligences. And that's why in integral theory we use something called the psychograph, which is a combination of as many lines as you want to work with, but usually at least 6 or 7.
Yeah.
So we include cognitive intelligence and emotional intelligence and moral intelligence and spiritual intelligence and kinesthetic intelligence and interpersonal intelligence and so on. And then we just line those all up on a graph and then graph the level of development in each of those intelligences that the person is at.
The question here is, how do you know in which level are you?
And so if you are, let's say, looking at your own spiritual intelligence and using James Fowler's model, then by learning his stages and then looking at your own characteristics, you would make a judgment about which stage you are at. And the same with moral development. If you used Kohlberg's model, you would study his stages and learn what each stage looked like. And then you would look at yourself and look at your own characteristics and make a judgment about which stage you were at in moral development.
Yeah.
And studies have shown people are usually quite accurate in their estimates of the stage that they're at.
I say that it's more or less like like you would look for the Enneagram questions, no?
Same thing.
Yeah, same thing. So it's a self-assessment process. Let's
yes.
say.
Now, of course, you can pay a psychologist to give you an actual test, which will fairly accurately measure what stage you're at in most of those lines. We have tests for almost all of them.
Yes.
And so you can take a test. But again, studies show that you're going to be quite accurate in your own self-assessment.
That's very interesting. Because I think that some people do not do not trust in their own self-assessment, and then therefore they want someone else to tell them how they are being seen. Let's say.
Well, that's true, and if that's the case, and you really are not quite confident of your capacity to do it, then you can always go to a professional and have it professionally done.
That's it. So what would it be the role of dreams from an integral viewpoint?
Sure. Well, dreams are generally, depending on which psychotherapeutic model you're using, will have a lot.
No. Integral viewpoint, Ken.
Well,
we are using the integral model.
The integral model can include any number of different models. And
yes.
so it can include different psychotherapeutic models as well. And depending on which psychotherapeutic model you're using in your integral model will largely determine how you look at dreams. Personally, I tend to follow, not entirely, but largely a Gestalt view, which is that dreams are some aspect of the self that is being projected and being disowned, and therefore shows up in the dream. And so the way that Gestalt works with that, and the way the 3-2-1 process works with that, is that you take every element in the dream and you basically identify with that element as a component of your own self. And you can also use dreams as picking up other types of information that you are unaware of using your ordinary or typical ways of knowing. And so it might, for example, be picking up some paranormal information. It might be displaying some sort of intuitive mode of information. It could be, if you are a particularly heavy thinking type, it could be representing feelings that you are unaware of about a particular situation. And so a dream can do all of those. And so you can use it in any number of ways. And generally you'll know if the way you're using it is accurate, because there'll be a type of aha, a type of, oh yeah, that makes sense sort of feeling that you'll get as you interpret the dream in that particular way. And so it tends to be reinforcing if what you're doing is more or less accurate.
Is there a way of interpreting dreams from an integral point of view?
Well, like I say, the integral point of view means that you have some model just in the psychology component, just in the upper left component, that includes most of the major developmental levels, including first, second, and third tier, and most of the major lines, including at least 7 or 8 major multiple intelligences, and most of the major states of consciousness, gross, subtle, causal, witnessing, and non-dual, and has some understanding of shadow elements and subpersonalities, and some way of treating dream states. And so that's the general theoretical model. But of course, if you're looking at, let's say, the cognitive intelligence, you can use either Piaget or Kurt Fischer as your major model. You can't use both because they have different terms and different stages and different ways of looking at it. But you have to use some model of it. So pick one. The integral model doesn't say which one to use. Now, I, Ken Wilber, have my own version of the integral model. And
tell us about it.
and it actually happens to include, in its own way, both some of Piaget's stuff and some of Kurt Fischer's stuff. But as for dreams, it's as I just explained. That's the Ken Wilber model of the integral model. But if somebody had like a psychoanalytic view of dreams, I wouldn't argue with that.
Right.
Because they're at least including dreams and the unconscious in their model. And that's more important to me than also agreeing with which model of dreams I choose. As long as they're choosing one of several that have some evidence and some backing and some proof and are believable, then that deserves to be called integral.
Whenever you use the 5 elements.
Yes, exactly.
Right. Because there is a tendency, I have seen it so many times, there is a tendency to believe that the integral technique is just one thing. And then we forget the other 4 elements, let's say, to be integral.
Exactly. And that's what we don't want to do. We want to make sure that we're covering all 5 elements.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is so important, Ken, what you have just talked, because, there is this question that is set up in this way. What is the integral way to do this? Well, it's the 5 elements again.
Right.
Yes.
So that's the most important part. So there's the general integral model, and like I say, it includes all the major levels of consciousness or structures of consciousness, all the major states of consciousness, all the major types, personality types, Myers-Briggs or Enneagram, and it, of course, has all 4 quadrants and preferably all 8 zones. And so it's covering all of those. But in each of those elements, there are usually several different models. And all I've said is, as long as you pick one of those in all of those elements, that's fine. It doesn't have to necessarily agree with the one that I choose. I'll tell you which one I prefer. But your model's still going to be integral if it includes one of the others. So there's the integral model and there's the Ken Wilber integral model. Right.
It's like in the integral practice when you say you choose one from all the ones that there are.
Exactly.
You choose one practice.
Exactly. And we include in the different modules we have, we include at least a dozen different items in each of them. So meditation, you can choose Zen, or you can choose centering prayer, or you can choose Vedanta. Choosing one of those is the only one right way. But if you don't have any at all, that's not integral.
Right. So where would you stand, would you put the hero's or heroine's journey within the integral theory, which would be the evolution level where it could be found, and how could it be worked from the 4 quadrants?
Well, what the hero's journey, it particularly has somebody like, let's say, Joseph Campbell presented it, which is starting out in a type of Garden of Eden of one sort or another, and then being separated from that, and then having to fight your way back to a more conscious, more mature version of that Eden. That's a type of story that first appears at Amber mythic level, and so you see it in a large variety of world heroic figures. So Otto Rank, for example, wrote a book on world heroes and showed that at least in mythologies, they all had a similar number of features. So, for example, they all started out, first of all, they all had at least two sets of parents. So
Who's
Christ...
parents?
Oh, always. So whether it's Moses or Christ or whoever, they have earthly parents and they have heavenly parents.
All right. Okay.
And they always start out with their earthly parents, and then at some point are separated from them, and have to find their heavenly parents as part of their journey. And they eventually do that. So Moses started out, and his real parents put him in a little raft and sent it down the river, and he ended up being adopted by Pharaoh. And then as events move forward, he comes to believe that that's not who he really is, and he leaves and takes all the Israeli slaves with him and runs to the burning bush on the mountain and discovers his true father. And so Christ did the same thing and referred to his father as Abba, referred to God as Abba, which is Arabic for daddy.
Yes. Yes.
And sometimes he spoke to God, sometimes he spoke about God, and sometimes he spoke as God. So that's first, second, and third person.
Third, yeah.
1, 2, 3 of God. So it's at that mythic stage that type of interpretation of life's journey most often occurs. But of course, at any higher stages can choose whatever symbols they want. And so even if you're at a rational or pluralistic stage, you can choose the hero's journey if that seems to make sense to you, and if that seems to organize the way your life is unfolding. Then you're perfectly free to adopt that particular myth as your own life story.
Because it will be a healthy way, a healthy myth, a healthy manner to use that level.
Yes, and Joe Campbell, in a little bit of a strange move, but one that actually shows the importance of rationality when it comes to mythic symbolism. The mythic level itself is believed to be literally true. So when you're at the mythic level, you believe that Moses really did part the Red Sea, and God really did rain locusts down on the Egyptians. And Lao Tzu really was 900 years old when he was born. And Padmasambhava really flew through the air, and so on. Now, Campbell, after writing this huge 4-volume set of mythology called The Masks of God, at one point says that I consider myth, taken in its literal form, to be a perversion of that myth, and that real myth is taken symbolically. Now, the reason he says that is that all of humanity goes, from archaic to magic to mythic, and so they all pass through this mythic stage. And if you believe it literally, it sounds like, the Tooth Fairy or Santa Claus or, Moses really parting the Red Sea. I mean, come on. So Campbell has to salvage this whole discipline of mythology because he believes it contains a higher truth than rationality. But he then says,
symbolically.
Well, he says that myth has to be understood symbolically. He says, actually compares it to Immanuel Kant. And he says that just as Kant discusses as if, so true myths are only understood when they're taken as if. So Moses parting the Red Sea, what that really means is it's as if Moses found a way to get the slaves out of Egypt. He didn't literally part the Red Sea. That just symbolizes his finding a way out of the slavery of Egypt. Now, the only problem with that is that as if and what if can only be understood by formal operational cognition. In other words, by rationality. So what Campbell ended up actually saying was that real myths can only be interpreted by rationality. And that the way they're normally taken, which is as literally being true, is a perversion of real myth, even though every single person at the mythic stage takes them as literally true.
Right.
So Campbell just called all of them perverts, but scholars who understand them rationally and read higher meanings into them using rationality are getting the real meaning of myth, which is just ridiculous. It's just, but of course,
I remember treating a person in the consultation which was really believing that God had a long white beard.
It's just amazing. But that's what concrete operational mythic literal does. And so it's not a perversion of myth. That's the natural state of myth. And reading these higher meanings into it, that's something that myth itself doesn't do. Only rationality does that, and only rationality is capable of doing that. And so all of these books you read on, the deep meaning of this myth and that myth and everything, they're all rational books.
Absolutely.
But that's fine if you want to rationally take a myth and read some sort of meaning into it, by all means, go ahead.
Right. Mm-hmm.
You know, just don't pretend that the original founder of the myth meant it the way you say they meant. They meant it literally.
Yeah.
And so when they said something, they didn't mean it symbolically. They meant it literally. So as long as you don't make that confusion, you go ahead and interpret it symbolically all you want. Just don't pretend the founder of the myth did.
Yeah, you explain it very clearly, Ken. That's great. Okay, and let's go with the last question. We don't want to really bother you much more and get you very tired. So let's make just the last question. And it says, how could we diminish the everyday violence from the integral point of view? Or do we think that we are destined as human beings to always be violent, and we cannot then be free from it, as we are somehow predetermined to be violent?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. Arthur Kessler, who, you know, was always a very, very clear, very careful, very evidence-based writer, and who did indeed introduce the terms holons and holarchy. In The Ghost in the Machine, where he takes a tour through consciousness and whatnot, he ends up concluding, and I remember when I first read it, I thought, well, this is just a little bit crazy. But I really respected Kessler's view, and so I at least had to think about it fairly seriously. But he said, and he's almost talking kind of exclusively about human males, to be really open about it. But he said that the humans had aggression was so innately wired into them, and that it's like, you know, for every year of peace has been 14 years of war and all that kind of thing, that the only way that humans would ever really stop with aggression is if we drugged them daily.
Oh, God.
I know.
Yeah.
Isn't that funny?
Yeah.
But he was dead serious. And so it makes you what you get from that, if nothing else, is the very strong difficulty of making human males stop killing each other. It is definitely a difficult task. But one of the things that we have learned from developmental studies is that drive to kill is predominantly located in the lower third of the stages of development. And that as you get to higher and higher stages, the less and less you're either willing to kill or even want to kill. So by the time you even get to green almost won't fight for any reason at all. It almost goes overboard. But it's vehemently against that type of activity. And so from an integral point of view, the general idea is to continue to work on human development. And we work on human development, first of all, by simply acknowledging that it exists. That's the problem we talked about earlier. Most academics and most of the conventional culture is just completely unaware of the overwhelming evidence for stages of development. And then one stage out of all of them, namely the green, denies stages altogether. So that's just idiotic. The rest of the stages agree that stages exist, but when they're told about it. But most of them just don't know about it. So what that means is that we have to educate for development. So we changed the educational system once in the last 30 years, and we took it away from orange, achievement, accomplishment, merit, grading, etc., and we gave it to green. Egalitarian, no ranking, no grading, no judging, everybody gets a gold star, everybody's equally special. And all that produced was a carload of narcissistic nutcases.
Absolutely, yeah.
So we take it out of that and we put it into sheer development and realize that there are actual ways that we can train for development. And the aim would be at the end of, say, high school, to have every graduating senior have reached at least orange, because that's the first world-centric level of development, whereas 70% of the world right now is at ethnocentric or lower. And that means that they think they're in a special group that's better than the others, and they're right and everybody else is wrong. And if they're religiously oriented, it even means that the other group, the out group, lacks a soul. They're infidels, and it's not a sin to kill an infidel. Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, it's a promotion. God likes you to kill infidels. So, but if we got people at least up to orange and out of ethnocentric, they would at least be largely unwilling to engage in murdering other human beings. Because they are identified with all of humanity, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed.
Yes.
And so there is hope for that. We don't have to drug people out of that, but we do have to get them out of stages that advocate aggression and advocate murder and advocate killing. And the lower stages do that. And so developing them up and out of those stages is one of the main things that we want to do with our educational systems worldwide.
But would you say that a person which is illuminated, let's say enlightened, would be violent?
Well, you see, that's the thing, because states and structures are relatively independent. You can be at any structure, including ethnocentric, mythic, and go through all of the states, even to the enlightened non-dual state, and still be ethnocentric.
But wouldn't you say that when we say that a person is enlightened, we wouldn't mean that it's only capable of arriving to a certain state, higher state, but we also mean that it has a very high structure, like third tier?
Well, that would be the new definition of enlightenment.
Oh,
but
right. Okay.
So you can read a book, for example, Zen at War, and there are very, very famous Zen masters who were advocating murder and war during World War II. and they were enlightened.
Yeah.
But they were at non-dual states, but they were still an ethnocentric structure.
Right. Yeah.
So what integral does is it ups the bar. It says to be enlightened is to be one with the highest state and the highest structure at any given time. So that means you have to be at the non-dual state and at least something like the turquoise structure. And turquoise would not be in favor of war.
Right. Very good, very good. Well, Ken, that's fantastic.
Okay.
A very, very enlightened conversation here, huh?
Thank you, my dear.
Absolutely. This is so wonderful. I wouldn't want to stop to you, but we don't want. I don't really want to get you more tired, even though I feel that you are much better than in the last year's talk. I see you much more like in your shoes, let's say.
Yeah.
So I'm very content for that, because that means that you kind of feel better.
Yeah.
No?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so glad for that, Ken.
Great.
Okay, dear.
Okay, my dear.
Thanks a lot.
Uh-huh.
And I cannot give you a big applause with the 200 or 300 people that are going to be in the meeting, but I give you my big applause. And I love you very much, and I thank you very much.
I love you, my dear. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you, Ken. Bye-bye then. Until next year. Bye.